What an orderly crowd you are. Thank you, Jerry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael O'Hare. I'm chair of TTT, the organisation that's running this event tonight. I'll just draw your attention to our footnote there on the poster here. It says, "We're healing the past for a better future." That's our mission. I would like to welcome you all here tonight to this event. It's a very powerful story where Jo Berry and Pat Magee, who have demonstrated remarkable courage in their journey towards reconciliation. After the IRA bombed the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984, killing Jo's father, Sir Anthony Berry, she could have chosen a path of anger or revenge, but instead she sought to understand the motivations behind the attack, and eventually met with Pat, the man responsible. Their story is testament to the human capacity for growth, empathy and forgiveness. Tonight we will hear how they work together to find a way forward and the lessons we can all learn from their shared experience. Our facilitator tonight is Collette Mackin, co-founder of the project director for TTTNIUK. I know Noreen likes to give it the full title. So would you please now welcome Patrick, Magee and Jo Berry. Thank you very much.
Good evening everyone, welcome. Thank you for all coming here and being here this evening. So the format that we usually carry out at TTT is we'll talk up here for about 40 minutes or so. We'll take a break and go out into the bar, and then we'll come back in and we'll have a Q&A session with yourselves. So Pat, I wanted to start off by asking you if you could tell us a bit about how you became involved with the IRA and why.
Well, that's a long story, and trying to get at an essence of it. I only returned to Ireland because I've been born there but brought up in England. I only returned to Ireland, specifically Belfast, after interment. Interment was on the 9th of August, a Monday. I was back in Belfast on the 15th. That would have been the Friday, wouldn't it, I think? And I didn't come back to get involved in the violence. I returned because I wanted to see what actually was happening on the ground. The British press was full of accounts of the violence in the streets during that week after internment. And although reportage in those days was better than it has been subsequently, as you might appreciate, you weren't getting the full picture, and I wanted to see for myself. So I returned to be a witness and to learn. Because this is a place I cared about. It's got all this coverage in the paper. I wanted to be there and to see for myself. That was the initial motivation for the return. But then living in the community, I was living in an area called Unity Flats, which was a real interface, a scene of conflict. It was one of those border areas in towns, two ghettos beside each other, constant conflict, even prior to what we call the Troubles. But it was seeing how the locals responded, and it was a small area, only about 300 houses, how they responded to what I clearly recognised as the oppression they were subject to by the British Army. This was a subjugated community, and I saw how they rallied together with the few resources at their disposal in human terms and all the other terms, and I just impressed with it. I couldn't just be a witness to that. I wanted in some way to make a contribution, to their struggle, their resistance to that struggle, to the struggle. And it took me a long time to figure out what my contribution could be. I wasn't a violent person. At one point I would have called myself a pacifist in that sense of being anti-war. If you're at a certain age, Vietnam was a big story and you're concerned about what's happening in the world. Your growing sense of right and wrong. And it was clear these people had no choice. This is my view, but to resist. And eventually I had to come to terms with what I could do. And here we am now, all these years later.
And Patrick, how old were you at that time?
I would have applied, let me give all these years later, dates elude me. I think I was 20. I think I was 20.
Was there a particular moment that you thought, I'm going to join?
Indeed, yeah. I've come to a fairly firm conclusion. And then I remember being arrested. I had been arrested before, as every young male was. There was a swoop for information, to gather information in every aspect of our communities. And so everybody got a touch. Was brought in, dragged in, questioned, and then usually let out again. But this was a continuous process. You'd been lifted several times. You were a young guy. But I remember being quite, given quite a rough time on one particular occasion, and it scared me. I mean, it scared me in thinking, what if I'd have known something? Could I have held that in just to get out of that horrible environment? And so it took me, I think, about 2 weeks to find something within myself, that had scared. I was fearful. And how would you describe it? The anger came back. I just didn't want to be a victim. And that's a common enough experience. And so I'm glad I went through that experience. That was necessary. That was the first test, if you like. And so, the anger came back, and I joined. I'd already made inquiries, but I joined up very soon after that.
And Jo, at this time, you were living here, and this was all going on back in Northern Ireland. You were living your life. What was happening in your life at the same time?
I grew up in London, went to school, and I do remember sometimes couldn't get to school because there were bomb scares. Bombs did go off, but I always thought I was safe. I lived in peacetime. That never occurred to me that my family would be affected. I do remember at different times hearing the news and being really upset. I was also very anti-war. When I was 15, I was very much beginning to be an activist against war and feeling strongly about Vietnam and just wanting all the fighting to stop. I cared deeply about wars and the idea that anyone was going to be killed just already really upset me. And I actually wrote an essay in 1980 and the question was, what relevance does Gandhi's views of non-violence have in London today? And I was not an essay writer, but I was just so inspired. I've still got it. It's really embarrassing as an essay. But I was already thinking about non-violence, and it was something that meant a lot to me. And then I went and lived in the Himalayas for a couple of years. And that was a very important time. I was living alongside the Tibetan people and learning about meditation and also more about non-violence and also about myself. And I think that was the time that, this was just before I came back in '84 from the Himalayas. And I think that time really gave me sort of the inner strength to make the decision that I did make.
And leading up to the day in October 1984 that you lost your father was killed. Can you tell us about those moments that you had with him before that?
Yeah, so I came back to London in June and he was killed in the October, and we spent a lot of time together in those last few months, and we had some really amazing conversations that still stay with me. And he was someone who was naturally very empathic, very understanding, and he was always trying to explain to me the reason why he was a Conservative MP was because he believed in peace. And I saw my life as about peace, but it was much more about meditation. You know, and I remember the point where I understood that, like, I never voted, I was very not political in those days, certainly never voted Conservative, but I could understand, we built a bridge, that was his motivation. He was really motivated to make the world a better place, and that was his way. And he also gave me his blessing. I remember him saying to me that, Jo, you're a little bit different. I'm trying to understand you and what life means to you. And so I think I understand. I think you're someone who thinks life, there is something there more than just the physical world. You know, there's something that you're looking for that isn't just about materialism. Is that right? There's something greater than anything that's directing you, guiding you. And he looked very pleased to himself. They kind of worked out that I had that kind of spiritual direction. And though it was difficult for him that I was living in the Himalayas, he definitely gave me his blessing. So I built a bridge with him. We didn't argue. You know, I did feel very strongly about the hunger strikers. That was a time when I was really in pain and distressed about what was happening. But we didn't argue. You know, it was more like I was wanting to understand and give him empathy. And when I think about the person I've been, I do think that what he modelled, he very much modelled a way of, no, let's not argue, let's try and understand each other. You know, he was so loved by everyone in this constituency. In fact, even recently, I heard from a family who got letters that my dad wrote in the 70s to this family. And he didn't need to write these letters. They were just to acknowledge us to help this family going through a lot of trauma. And that's who he was. He would just reach out and care about people. So yeah, those conversations were really, really special. He himself was going through a hard time that last summer. And so I was giving him lots of support.
And how did you find out that he was killed?
I was staying with my twin sister, and she'd got up earlier than me. She was off to work in a school as a teacher, and she saw the headlines that a bomb had gone off at the Grand Hotel. So she woke me up and wanted to know which hotel was Dad staying at, Dad and our stepmother, Sarah. And I was pretty sure it was the Grand Hotel. So that began, there must be about 6 in the morning, and we had to wait till about 3 o'clock. And during that time we were waiting for any news. My brother he just happened to be living in Brighton, and he'd been and had dinner with our dad the night before. So we managed to wake him up, and he went to the Grand Hotel, where there was this chaos, people in their pajamas, people just like hurt, just dust everywhere. And he managed to persuade the police for him to go through the guard to ask questions. And then he saw the room that Dad had been staying in, and it didn't exist anymore. It had gone. And I think that's for him when he thought the chances of finding him alive were very, very little. And he managed to find my stepmother in hospital, and the two of them stayed together until he was asked to go back to the hotel to identify my dad's body.
So as a result of this, Pat, you ended up in prison. You spent 14 years in prison. And I wondered, you know, through that time, knowing the people that were killed and the people that were injured, did you think about them? Did you think about them, you know, individually, particular people? Did you find anything out about them? What were your thoughts during that time in terms of what you had done?
I spent very little time thinking about any operation I was ever involved in. And that may come as a shock to a lot of people, because you're thinking you're in isolation, therefore all this space to think about these matters. What's not appreciated is that we saw prison as another front in the struggle. We didn't have this space to go over the past, or very little time to do that. There were moments. It was more, how do we survive as political prisoners in this situation where we're isolated from, you know, removed from the struggle, but into another front.
And that was your focus of your time, that's what you spent your time doing?
you found that one of the ways of keeping the walls back, but there is that feeling of pressure. But you're very claustrophobic, obviously, over a long protracted period of time. And I did it through reading, through education. Others did it through, I suppose, exercise or their own small projects. For me, it was education.
Yeah. And Jo, while Pat was in prison, what was going on in your life at that time?
Yeah, so it was 2 days later that I found myself in a church in London, St James's Church in Piccadilly. And I remember sitting on a pew and I was very overwhelmed. It was our job to tell our little brother and sister their dad had been killed. We were in a state of the media intrusion, just overwhelmed. The whole thing was, as you can imagine, really traumatic. But I sat there and it came to me, if I can find a way to bring something positive out of this, if I can bring some meaning, if I can understand why people chose to kill my father, then maybe I'm going to be okay. And I didn't want to have an enemy, but I had an enemy at that time. And so a journey started, and that journey was one where, I had no map. I didn't know how do you bring something positive out of this. I had absolutely no idea. But I trusted that somehow life was going to bring me the experiences. And the first one was just a few months later when I ended up sharing a taxi with a complete stranger, just a random stranger. We were both late at night, there weren't many taxis around, and we were going similar direction. So we got a taxi, and I could tell he was from the north of Ireland. So I said to him, this might seem a little bit an odd question, but my dad's just been blown up by the IRA. Can you help me understand why someone would join the IRA? What's happening in the communities? And he looked at me and said, no, that's not strange at all, because my brother was in the IRA and he was killed last year by a British soldier. So there we were. We should have been enemies. We could have been enemies. This is the height of the conflict. This is in '84. But instead, we spoke of a world where peace was possible, where nobody killed, where nobody got killed. And I remember leaving that taxi and thinking, I can build a bridge across the divide. And even though no one knows, I know. And it gave me a sense of that's my first step. I built a bridge. And I ended up flying to Belfast 9 months later to attend a workshop. There was a workshop by an amazing woman called Kubler-Ross on finishing unfinished business, and it was in Benbow Priory in South Armagh. And after that workshop, I stayed because I shared some of my story there, and people said, please don't go home, will you come and stay with us? I've got people I'd like you to meet. And so I went to Belfast in, this was just '85. And I found people, they just welcomed me. I went to houses. I gave my first talk to a born-again group in '85. There were 1,000 people there, and I was absolutely terrified. I was very shy, but I spoke, and I found that I had a part to play. I had a part to play in the work they were doing. I actually met someone very high up in Sinn Féin. I met an incredible woman called Anne Gallagher, who was the reason that we actually eventually met. And one of her brothers was in prison, and he wrote me a letter, 2 letters as well. So it was all about rehumanizing the other. And I would have gone a few times over, and then I got to a point where I stopped. I think because I hadn't emotionally dealt with any of the trauma, and I was way out of my depth. I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt very, very safe, But I do remember one of my daughters got involved in a project university, and she ended up walking down Falls Road with me, with someone who was a member of the IRA, ex-prisoner. And he said to her, you do realise when your mum was here in the 80s, she put her life in danger. And I was like, don't tell her that. She doesn't need to know. It's fine. But it was almost like I didn't care, because I just wanted to I just wanted to engage. I wanted to meet people. I wanted to see people as human beings. That was more important than anything. So it was an extraordinary time. And then I left London and went and lived in North Wales, and I had started my family. And all those years, every time anyone was killed, I felt the pain. I didn't mind what side. I felt it. I just wanted it all to stop. And it didn't feel like I could do anything. I didn't know how. And so I cried quite silently. And I never told anyone in North Wales about my dad. Never told, no one knew. It was something that I just kept quiet. And even my children didn't know about their granddad, how he'd been killed, until after the peace process, until probably the year 99.
That's remarkable. I mean, some of us from TTT were at the Embassy of Ireland on Wednesday night, and there was Patrick Keelty, and he was talking about his story and losing his father, and about telling his children that. And it does strike me that it takes some time to be able to do that with your own children. Do you want to share with us how you did explain to them?
I'm trying to remember exactly. So it was all around the time that after the peace process that I started getting invited to go to. It was the first time after the peace process that anyone from England who'd been affected was invited to any of the workshops or meetings or get support. I didn't get any support until 2000 from my own trauma. And I needed to be able to tell them and hear their reaction. And when I couldn't tell anyone myself, it wasn't possible. So that's why it took so long. And for them, but they're on their journey, like they've been affected. They've lost a granddad they never met, But they're incredible. But there was, well, actually, no, that's going ahead too much. I'll tell you that story later. That's after I met Pat. So.
And so, in meeting Pat, what was your motivation? You wanted, along the way, you obviously met lots and lots of people who had lots of stories to share.
Yeah.
When was the moment you decided, I want to meet Pat and I want to understand this better?
But the idea of building a bridge, in 86 I thought of it, but I knew it wasn't an appropriate time. And then I remember Pat being released from prison, and definitely that was a moment where I thought, okay, now we have peace process. Maybe now I can meet him. And it took a year and a half after that. And during the year 2000, I met a few people who said they could organise the meeting. And one was a part of a prisoners group. Someone else was a mediator. They all had their part, and it seemed like the whole world in Northern Ireland, they all knew Pat. They all said, oh yeah, I've got a way of finding him. I'll make sure it will happen. And then 3 times I heard back, nope, he doesn't want to meet you. And the way I remember being, okay, well, there's other bridges to build. I was meeting family, the hunger strikers. I was in Derry meeting people who lost loved ones there. There was lots of bridges to build. I'm just going to carry on doing that. And then I wrote a poem for Pat called Bridges Can Be Built, and I shared it at a peace conference, and there was someone there who said, you want to meet him? I'll organise it. And I said, okay, please do. And then he got in touch with Anne Gallagher, who's sadly no longer with us, and she met with this man, and she then rang me up. I remember the Friday morning when she rang me up, she was like, okay, Jo, Pat Magee will be in my house tonight. Can you come? And I was going to get the ferry from Holyhead to Dublin to go to Glencree Reconciliation Centre. But I wasn't planning to meet Pat on the way, it was not on my agenda. And I remember thinking, oh no, not today. I'm not in the mood. How am I going to do that today? It's like, that feels huge. But then I thought, this is so huge. I'm off to meet the man who killed my dad. This is huge. So I said yes to Anne. And I knew that I wanted to meet him not to tell him that he was bad, not to get an apology, really just to hear his story, to be able to look into his eyes and see him as a human being. And my plan was that I'd meet him once, that would be that, and no one would ever know. That was my plan, and it would restore something the bomb took from me, if I could see him as a human being. But I was terrified. I was actually terrified. I now do restorative justice processes like this breaks all the rules, okay? So I'm on the ferry. There's no one there supporting me. No one knows. There's just me on this ferry wanting to build a bridge. And when I arrived at Anne's house, it was not a prepared environment. Anne herself's phone were going, it was an activist house. At one point Anne said to me, "Jo, can you finish cooking?" And I'm like, I can't cook. I can't think of anything because of what's about to happen. I was terrified. And I remember Pat walking in and I got up and shook his hand and thanked him for coming. And I said, "I really appreciate you changing your mind and you agreeing to meet me." And he said, "Oh, I've heard a few times that you've wanted to meet me and I've always said yes." And so that was an interesting moment because we started talking about how the fact he said yes, I heard it as no, you know, and I think people were either protecting Pat or me. So early on in the peace process, I kind of understand it. Like, looking back on it, it was a little bit crazy, but it worked. You know, it worked because that first meeting, I'll never forget it. It was 3 hours long, and Pat, I knew Pat would want to come very much sharing with me his political motivation of why he joined the IRA. And I was very familiar with that. I'd met other men in the IRA. I knew that's what he would give me. And then I remember sharing the poem, and I think that was the beginning of the turning point, because I remember Pat saying to me, "How could you write that poem before you met me?" But before that, I was actually about to end the meeting because it was quite hard hearing Pat justify killing my father, because you were seeing it's a strategy that worked. You know, for me, it can't be a strategy that worked because, like, my dad, I still miss him. But I got what I want, because I remember looking at Pat and seeing, like, in his eyes how much he cared for his community. I saw his struggles. I saw a lot of emotion, and at that moment, he was a human being with a story. But it was hard hearing him justify killing my father, so I was about to go. And then that's when there was this moment that I still remember, and Pat said to me, "You know, I don't know anymore who I am. Can I hear your pain? Can I hear your anger? What can I do for you? I've never met anyone so open as you before." And so I stayed because that was different. You know, his tones of his voice changed, his language changed. There was no more we. He started talking about I. And it was very emotional, another hour and a half. And at the end of the hour and a half, I'd reached my limit, because as I'm listening and being present to Pat, I'm also listening to parts of me that do find it difficult. You know, remember, there's a voice in my head going, "You shouldn't be here. This is not okay." You know, but I didn't. I listened, but I also stayed because what I really wanted to do was to be present to Pat. But I'd reached my limit, and I said to Pat, "I'm going to go now." And that's when he said to me, I'm really sorry I killed your dad." Now, I didn't need an apology, but what I got from that was, and it had been growing throughout the last hour, was the sense that my dad is no longer just a legitimate target to Pat. My dad is now a human being. Pat is rehumanizing my dad. He's a real person, you know, and that did mean something to me. That meant something really special. And I then said to Pat, "I'm so glad it's you," which just came out of me, and I don't think Pat knew what I meant. But what I meant was, and it's actually still true, was I couldn't have predicted Pat's preparedness to open up and engage and feel the impact, to hear the impact. Like, that's harder, I believe, for him. Like, it was much easier for him before he met me, but now he sees my dad as a real human being, and he's responsible for that death. And I couldn't have predicted that he would have the courage. I think it takes deep, deep courage to open up and to feel it and engage in this restorative process, which we've been in now for almost 25 years. And I feel the same after 25 years. I don't think many men would have had that courage to open up. And therefore, you know, I'm still grateful to him for engaging with me, because it's not easy.
Pat, I imagine that was a difficult knock at the door to make. How are you feeling?
Again, I need to set it in context. The release program from prison due to the peace process was in full operation. And so you're preparing mentally for that moment when you go through the gates and try to rebuild your life in this new dispensation of the peace process. And as I mentioned before, I had spent quite a time studying and had in mind that perhaps something I was now capable of doing was to explain the conflict from our perspective, which hadn't been dealt with, was unappreciated. But then, a few months before my release, I received a letter from somebody who was a victim in Brighton, who'd been injured and buried under tons of rubble for hours. And I found that deeply affecting. And so a correspondence followed, and even an agreement at some future point I would meet him. So I added this need to talk about the past and to victims, to what I had in my mind. And but the first year out, you're so overwhelmed with having to get back on track, build, something for yourself and your new family, that the troubles didn't really encroach that much. But then, and I had heard several times during the course of about 18 months before the actual meeting with Jo, that a woman whose father was killed in Brighton, who was one of the ones killed in Brighton, wanted to meet me, and I would have asked, is it likely to be confrontational? Would it, I didn't want to go into a situation where you weren't moving things on a bit, at least. And I did always say yes. But then I was working in Dublin. I was working on a building site. We couldn't get work, so you get what comes, I get this call to go and meet, already mentioned, Anne Gallagher, incredible woman, who says, look, I can get you to meet Jo if you're here tomorrow. And turned up at that door, and I had some mental preparation for it. I thought what I need to do here, try to do it with some sensitivity, is to talk about our motivations and the context of the war in the day. And hopefully that in some way will help, I don't know, perhaps expecting too much to do that in one meeting. But to me, that's all I could see. Then I found myself talking with this woman for 3 hours. I didn't know it was 3 hours, but I'm sure it was. And what was obvious was there's no feeling of aggression. In fact, I think I would have found that easier to handle. I would expect it, even, you never know what to expect in such a moment. Somebody sharing this loss and this pain, and you're aware of your responsibility for this. I'm sitting in this room with a woman, and I killed her father, and she's really listening. She's given me, in that sense, more time, I could even say respect, than up to that moment I had appreciated, because our story was never heard. And I think the moment of change was Jo's recital of this poem. And she was talking about meeting me. And she'd written this poem, I'm guessing, 4 to 6 months prior. I'm sitting in this room, and she's reading this, and I found it deeply touching. And I think it changed the conversation. Jo was right. I went there with a kind of a political hat on, thinking that's all I have to do, talk about the past, my part on it. That'll do. Part. Done, Now it's a new conversation. Jo's talking about the impact on her family, on herself, a lot about her father, how they had, if I may allow to use the word, of some form of reconciliation in their own lives, and which was important to Jo, and she's sharing that with me, you know. Think of that. And then just, this is quite apparent, you know. She's a very fine woman, intelligent and committed. And then just something clicked in my head, you know. It says, you know, the value and the good I can see in this woman must have, in some measure, come from this man. You know, it's in her mental makeup and all of that. And I killed the guy, you know. And, you know, that means I'd killed a fine human being. That's the only way I could think about it. See, before that moment, I hadn't given any thought to it. He was a Tory. My thinking hadn't really evolved much from the time that it happened and before. He was a Tory, and that justified it. Gathered in that hotel were all the people we felt culpable for the terrorism in our streets, the terrorism of the oppression from the British Army, etc., and for what it had done politically in partitioning our country. But then I'm seeing beyond that, and for the first time, I think, you know, that was a hard realization, and I wasn't expecting it. And so the conversation did change a bit. It was more open and vulnerable, you know. And at the end of those 3 hours, it couldn't have continued. You know. It had to stop then. And then Jo said that, you know, I'm glad it was you, and that was a puzzle. And you see, the days after that, I felt there was more to be said. There was a real deep, visceral need to continue that conversation or other conversations with other people on a similar vein. As I said, I recognise something without being able to, you know, fully vocalise it. So it was a turning point in my life.
And Jo, have you ever shared that poem with anyone else?
Oh yes, yes, I've shared it with Pat on many stages. In fact, I was in a little place outside Derry recently giving a talk, and someone said, "Oh, have you got the poem?" And there was a woman sitting there, and she said, "I've got it because I've got Pat's book," and Pat has signed it, and so she lent me her book because the poem is in Pat's book, which it's a very amazing book Pat's written. So yeah, I read it. So that was just recently, but I've definitely shared it on the stage with him. I mean, I'm not a poet, but what it has in it is it has like the reasons why I met him and sort of my vision for a world where we can build bridges.
And what were the next steps at the end of that first meeting that you had? What way did the conversation end, and did you agree to meet again?
So we left with no plan. I think we just both felt absolutely exhausted. And then in the weeks after, I think we both felt we wanted to meet again. I remember Anne ringing me up and saying, Pat's agreed to meet again at my house, and he's agreed for someone to come to film it. You know, would you come? And I said, "Oh, Pat's agreed for it to be filmed." "Oh, yeah, okay." I said, "All right, I will." And then she rang up Pat and said, "Oh, Jo's agreed." This is before I'd agreed. Anne was very clever. So we both thought the other one had agreed to film. And actually the man who filmed it is sitting here, Michael Appleton. And without him, we would not have been able to carry on meeting. And when he arrived and heard our conversation, he sensed this was something that was really important and profound. And so he arranged for some funding so we could carry on meeting, and that turned into the first documentary. But we both went towards that documentary going, it's not going to happen, and we're not going to go public with this. At different times we were both going, no, we're going to stop. So poor Michael had the difficult job of trying to manage the BBC, and then us saying, no, we can't go public. But actually, just in time, all contracts were signed, and we did a year later go public. But I mean, that was huge for both of us for obviously different reasons. And then once we'd gone public, then I remember the first time we were asked to speak somewhere, or maybe the second time in London, and we were given like 3 minutes each. You know, obviously didn't think we could say a lot, so like 3 minutes. But I remember Pat saying, I now know I can sit down and have a cup of tea with Jo's dad. And that stayed with me, because that's what this is about, you know. And I can see, you know, the two of them sitting down having a cup of tea, which to me is about respect, you know, it's about shared power, it's about dignity, it's about communication and dialogue, you know, and how much better would it have been if the Conservative government had a policy of cups of tea, you know, if like cups of tea of dialogue happens before violence comes on the agenda. But I'll never forget those words that he said. And 25 years almost after your first meeting, the two of you have done this many, many times. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the role of truth and accountability in reconciliation, and maybe, Pat, you want to speak about that a little and what your thoughts are?
Well, first let me say that this is the first time we have talked to the Irish community, people of the Irish community in Britain. It never happened before, we never asked. And yet, at one point, I counted a number of occasions we had met and talked and shared, and I just stopped at 100. And I wouldn't like to put a figure on it now, but I'd say it's more than 200 anyway, maybe 300. And so it's quite unique tonight for me, you know, it's important for me. I've kind of lost the track there. But so there's all that engagement, if you like, this continuing conversation. And you'd imagine that after so many occasions talking, sharing, you might have come up with answers, solutions, etc., moved on in our own thinking. I'm not aware of it particularly. I think what our meetings have demonstrated is that it's possible after tragic event, me killing Jo's father, all that ensued from that it's possible to sit in a room and talk about these matters, you know. It's I am still at heart a Republican. I mean, I still have the same political beliefs, but I have a wider understanding now about the nature of the conflict, the nature of the pain caused on all sides, and in a sense I'm hoping to share some of that, what I've learnt. And therein is the value, you know. This is possible, this can happen, you know.
Thank you. Jo, I wondered if you wanted to talk to us a little bit about your charity, Building Bridges. You know, it's really apparent that that's what your mission has been, and alongside Pat. And it's, you know, really valuable. I think a lot of people will take a lot from that. Certainly for us, TTT, and the work we do, it is about healing the past for a better future. And just talk to us a little bit about Building Bridges.
Thank you. So for the 40th anniversary of the bomb, Pat and I spoke in London, back at the place where I'd made that commitment all those years ago. And for me, this year is a year to bring more kindness and empathy and compassion into the world. And I don't know how many times, probably travelled to Northern about eight times already, speaking with young people. I also do a lot of work in schools, in Muslim schools, where young people there are dehumanised and they've already gone through trauma and feel that people see them as less than. So my passion is to hear and acknowledge and to work with people. I see all young people as positive change makers. They've inherited a very difficult world. And what I found is that through sharing my story, it kind of creates a trust between me and people who don't know me before. And then it's not about me anymore, that I'm a facilitator. So I do a whole lot of workshops on empowering young people to be positive change makers. Also do a lot of international work. I think one of the things that I've really learned, or I'm still learning, because I'll never say I know always how to listen, but I think to listen so that people feel heard and validated. And I think that's what Pat felt first time I met him. He felt really heard. And we all need to be heard, you know, we all need to be acknowledged and validated. And so my charities is tiny. There's just me and a few trustees, all amazing women, and we don't get much funding. But I got a big vision, you know, like I could have retired, but actually I feel like I'm just starting, because I feel it used to be that my heart was very connected to Northern Ireland, and it still is. And every time I go there, I always feel so at home. But also I feel connected to people in every part of the world. We've been to Palestine and Israel together. We've been to Rwanda and Lebanon, and there's some countries Pat wasn't allowed to go to that I went on my own. And we've been to Kosovo together, you know, we've heard stories of people around the world. And I think that's my passion, is to find a way that we actually stop killing each other and people have choices to communicate without hurting each other, because I do believe the legacy is too great. You know, that's what I've been hearing recently in Northern Ireland. Young people, they're still feeling the trauma, you know. So my dream is eventually it's not that we stop violence because there's no need for it. Or, yeah, we stop violence because there is no need, because people have other ways to communicate, people are heard. I also got a vision about bringing some empathy. I call it unbounded empathy. It's not just empathy for those that are like us, it's for those that are different as well. Because I've had that experience with Pat, with that empathy with him, that I wondered, you know, if I'd lived Pat's life, would I have made the same choice? And I've had that experience with someone who was in the British Army, someone from a loyalist paramilitary, and it shows me that when I listen, when I really, really listen, there are no sides. But we do live in a world where there's always going to be the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, and it's very polarised at the moment. But I'm interested in how can we actually listen to everyone. And when we give people that empathy, then we're going to care for them as much as we do for our own family. So Building Bridges has a big vision, but there is only me doing it. So it's like little things hopefully every day, every week.
And just before we go to take a break, Jo, I wondered, what do you think your father would think of what you're doing today?
Cool. I think that he'd understand that out of his 6 children, I would do things a little bit differently, because I always did. You know, and I think he would know, he would support me, you know, because he himself was someone who refused to see difference. You know, he had a lot of friends in the Labour Party when he was killed who shared the stories how much they loved him. You know, he wasn't someone who just stayed with his own group. He himself was curious, so I think that he would support me, but of course, you know, I might be wrong, who knows?
Thank you both very much, Pat and Jo, thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Just hold the mic right up to your mouth, please, when you're asking a question. Brief questions, and please give your name beforehand. I'm going to start off with the first question, and I wanted to ask both Pat and Jo if there has been any particular part of this journey that has been difficult in terms of your reconciliation.
Well, you may mistakenly believe that because we've been sharing platforms on so many occasions over nearly 25 years ago that it's always easy. It's become easy, and it hasn't. Believe me, if it became easy, you would just give up and wouldn't do it anymore, you know, because I would have suggest you've arrived at some level of understanding. That isn't the case. You keep doing it because it's a journey in trying to understand, you know, the past, this other. And sometimes, because it's difficult, you get it wrong. You're not in the right frame, you say something wrong, you misjudge a mood, and it can hurt. It can hurt people in the audience. It could be me hurting Jo. And so there's been moments like that. Don't need to go into details. But what usually happens is we can be triggered. Somebody can make a comment and then suddenly you become defensive. You feel you have to dig your heels in and make your point, and that can't be right in the moment when the focus should be on this traumatic event we're talking about. You know, when the hurt caused, you're trying to make sense of that. But as again, you can be triggered, and well, I'm better at dealing with that, I have to say. So I've learnt that at least. You know.
Jo?
Yes, there have been times, Pat shared just then, when for always understandable reasons, Pat's become defensive, felt maybe attacked, and moved back to a more political position. And we've taken breaks because this is about choice. You know, Pat can always stop, I can always stop. But what means that we carry on is that Pat's got an incredible ability to listen and to acknowledge whatever I'm feeling without justifying. And that is such a gift. So he can really hear that that was upsetting for me, whatever it was I was going through. And that is so disarming. That immediately makes me then feel, okay, we can build the trust and we can carry on speaking. I think if Pat didn't have that ability to really acknowledge how an experience is for me, if he just stayed in his position of justification of his own behaviour, then it wouldn't happen. And it's that to me is unusual. You know, I don't think many people have that ability to be able to just really hear my pain, understand it, and then almost what do we need to do now to move on. And those kind of conversations they go on away from the stage, and you know, the trust has grown over the last 25 years. So anytime we have a challenge, I know that we can talk about it, we can share about it, and have a very honest, very real, and it feels like, you know, adult to adult conversation about what's happened. And that makes it safe for me to carry on.
Thank you both for your honesty. Okay, questions from the floor. If you want to put your hand up, please. Kathy, just the mic is coming to you now.
Jo, this is for you. I came here tonight, I didn't really know what to expect. I just thought when you're telling your story, gunmen came into my family home uninvited, masked, etc. My mother always wanted to meet them, she did say that she forgave them, but she never saw their faces. We never really knew. They didn't achieve anything. I lost my 3 brothers, and what you're saying, you know, we didn't get the opportunity that you have had to meet Pat. So, you know, thank you for sharing that story, and I'm completely moved and quite devastated this evening about the whole process. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. You know, your story is another story of just nightmare, trauma, and you know, once something like that happens, and what happened to me, and I'm sure that other people in the audience, life is never the same again, you know, and sometimes it is possible to have a conversation and meet the person, and sometimes it's not. What I've learnt by hearing stories around the world, and I'm very involved in people who've been affected by terrorism from 7/7 and onward, you know, there is no one to meet because there was suicide bombing, or you know, in Kosovo they have no idea. They have no idea where the bodies are. You know, once violence arrives, then what is justice? How can we mend? How can we heal? You know, we're all grasping and trying to find answers with all these massive obstacles, like for you not knowing. I believe that despite, well, dreadful things happen to many, many people, and we can choose how we respond if we get support. You know, if we get maybe the right kind of trauma therapy, there are people there to give us that listening, that acknowledgement. It is possible to turn it around. And I've seen people do that around the world, and yet I do believe to stop our need for revenge, sometimes it does feel like stopping gravity. It's that difficult. This is emotional work, isn't it? It is emotional. So I can understand that you're finding this emotional. You know, people who are involved in any kind of inflicting pain on others, I feel like the emotions aren't there. They've been cut off, and they're in a place where they're not seeing human beings anymore. They dehumanize them. And to me, it doesn't matter what the name is. That is the process. We make people less than us, then we can hurt them. You know? And so how can we really see people in their full humanity, so that what you went through and your family and many others, you know, it won't happen again. But thank you.
Yes, lady in the second row.
And this is a question for both of you. In terms of your own families and friends and community, did you feel that they always supported or understood your journey towards reconciliation? And if they didn't, how did you deal with that or process that?
You want to go?
Well, if I can answer first. See, what I do is I do on my own. I'm not part of the Republican movement. I didn't join Sinn Féin on release. And you find that a lot of people who came through that struggle, it's going on in their heads. You know, because I've had some opportunity to, you know, burst some of the, you know, trauma in my head. A lot of people don't, and it's hard for them to move on. And I'm saying that because I've had experience of people questioning why I'm doing this, Republicans questioning why I'm doing it. And I'm talking about more than 20 years now, but 23 years ago. I remember former comrade, somebody I had the highest regard for, saying, "Patty, you mad? Do you think for 1 second you're going to be allowed to go on British television and justify the armed struggle?" And I never thought that for a second. But I did think there was an opportunity here to be heard, for a Republican to be heard. Wouldn't get to say everything I would like to have said, but it was a start. So now, within 6 months of, I should have explained that, I was working on a documentary with Joe, and so we were a lot of trepidation about how that might be received, I guess, in our respective communities. And I think it was rebroadcast 6 months after the first occasion, and mood had changed. I definitely picked up. But everybody was looking around and wondering, you know, because it hadn't really been done like that up till that moment. So it was a step, you know. That's what you pick up on. Moving slowly forward, you know, building trust. I think it's so important, you know, and it's just building that trust up. But you have to bring everybody with you, you know. And if you don't bring them with you, you know, you leave them behind, you don't know what could fester, you know.
Jo, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so when I went to meet Pat 24 and a half years ago, no one knew. I didn't tell any of my family, because I just thought I'm just going to meet him once and that will be that, and no one will know. You know, and it was only in sort of the last 2 or 3 weeks before the documentary was about to come out that I suddenly, well, I didn't suddenly, I just put it off. I thought, I have to tell my family now. You know, I have to tell my stepmother, my mother, 5 siblings. I have to write to everyone who was affected by the bomb, the other families who were bereaved, injured. And that was difficult for me, because I really thought I would be accused of betraying my father, and I have been accused of betraying my father. People have found what I've done really challenging, but I wanted my family to really understand, and they were amazing. it has been difficult for them, for sure. There are times when I'm sure they're just like, oh my goodness, Jo's on the telly again with that man. I'm sure that for them it's difficult. It's not their journey. They've responded differently. None of them are bitter, but they have responded differently to me. But if anyone comes to me, and they have done, and they've said they disagree with what I've done, then I'll listen to them. I'm not here to persuade anyone anything. This is a very personal response. And I understand people who feel like I betrayed my father, people who feel what I've done is a step too far. I really understand it, because that's how we normally are. We normally don't make friends with the enemy. That's not something that's normal. But for me, this is about changing the future. If one person can benefit from this, then it's worthwhile. I can't change the past, but I'm never going to get in an argument about it. And all these years on, some of my family are a bit more supportive than others, and it's fine. I have my own support team of people who are there for me. My family they can dip in and out of that. I don't have any expectation at all. But I was quite surprised, I'll share this, my older sister, she thought of coming tonight, and she physically couldn't get here for all sorts of reasons, But that just so touched me that after all these years, she said she wanted to come in here and she was thinking about me. So there's always going to be amazing times as well as challenging times. I didn't do this for an easy life. I really deeply am doing this to try to change things.
Yeah, I think, that's a really poignant thing. It is your journey, and it's your journey. And TTT, we've had a story of two people that have reconciled before, Richard Moore and Charles Ines, and there was definitely that feeling. Not all of you may know the story, but Richard was blinded as a result of a plastic bullet when he was a child, and I think there was definitely that feeling of people felt something, and it was their feeling. And actually it was their individual journeys, and that's important. Any more questions? Bernard, front row.
Hi, thanks very much. I really appreciate the talk. It was very inspiring, just to the two panellists, just curious, dare I say, in the 26 counties in what's the Republic of Ireland, and over this side of the Irish Sea, sadly there can be an indifference to the conflict and perhaps an ignorance. And I'm just wondering what your view is on that, basically. But thank you.
From my perspective, which is basically a supporter of Sinn Féin and the peace process and the dynamic and the dialogue that's developing, I've seen a lot of progress. I'm somebody who knows the South intimately. I was on the run in the South for a long time, and I was active in the South as well. And I've been in every part, so I know feelings on the ground, and it's changing. It's slowly, and there's set ways, and people will disagree, and sometimes people are right to disagree with some of the things we've done. So there's all of that to deal with, and there's interests there that are opposed to political developments. So it's a very complicated, uneven political situation and culture in regard to reunification, for example, and merging. That's what we have to deal with, It's about bringing people along, and important to that is contact. Absolutely is important. The more contact there is, the more there is an appreciation of what actually happened, I'm learning of it, as people in the South wouldn't have had, be in the position that I have coming through it. And even I don't know all that was happening. That's got to be part of the resolution, At the moment, we're too separated. It's bringing people together and sharing the stories and making people aware of actually what did happen, because it's not known to any extent, you know.
My name's Daniel from County Tyrone, and I've been over here for a long time. I'd like to thank both of you. It's been an eye-opener. Now, for myself, I can identify with Pat very easily, you know, and I understand where he's coming from. But yourself, it's, you know, for you to take this journey is just totally and utterly amazing. You know, I really thank you for what you've done. And just one question to both of you is, I know you said you were a spiritual person. Is there ever been a religious aspect to this? And, you know, we're probably brought up a Catholic and, you know, religious. And has that ever played a part in what you're doing?
Thank you for your supportive, wonderful words. There is nothing religious about it for me. And I've had people tell me that it is a Christian experience. And for me, it's really important this is a human experience. I don't know what it is, but it's human. Like, we all have this ability to transform what's happened to us. We all have the ability to not hate, to listen, to be compassionate. And I don't want to be part of identify as any group. I'm doing this because I'm a human, not because of my faith or my religion. That to me is really, really important. I don't think any religion's got a monopoly on being compassionate. You know, there are people who have no faith who are compassionate, those are religious. So I'm looking at what's the deepest thing we have in common as humanity, and that's the bit that I get strength from and connects me.
I must share that. You know, I believe in people. I believe in communities. I've been a witness to what communities can do together when they combine their limited resources in a struggle. And for me, there's something. There's no words for it, but if I can fall back on a sense of, you know, spirituality. I can think that. You're right. I was brought up a Catholic. Served as an altar boy, served in the choir. I used to serve the priest before I went to school. I used to get up and go and serve 6 o'clock mass. Then suddenly, I think it was about 11, I just bail dropped or something, and I just didn't believe it because I didn't think. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't allowing there might have been some process of thought going on that I wasn't aware of. But just one day, I no longer believed. You know, it's like that moment, you know, you no longer believe in the Tooth Fairy or Father Christmas. It was something like that. And I hope I'm not being insulting to anybody who has, you know, like faith of whatever. But that was for me. But definitely, you know, when you're a witness to so much, you know, you question, you do question. And so, but and quite honestly, it's beyond my mental capacity to deal with that. So I fall back on community. You know, I know there's good in that.
Hi, my name's Ronan. I'm with my mum here. Her name's Mary. She forgot to say it, but I wanted to ask Pat a question. My mum and my dad always raised me, and they were very emphatic that violence was never the answer. And I would sort of always maybe try and play devil's advocate and wind them up and sort of ask them questions about it and read about it myself. And increasingly, even in my own friend group, I sort of read about it and we talk about it and we say, well, what else were you did to do? They were being oppressed, of course. There was going to be an armed reaction, of course. They were going to fight back or whatever. And it's looked upon almost a wee bit admirably. And then you hear Jo speak and you're sort of sitting there and you're like, how can you have any countenance for that? So I'd be interested now, Pat, are you of that opinion that violence is never the answer? If you see so much sort of war and violence in the world, like in Israel and Gaza, and I sit there and I watch about the conflict and all that, and I think, how are Gazan children and Palestinian children ever going to be raised and not want to blow up an Israeli? And you just sort of wonder, how do you sort of sit with that now, that violence is never the answer, and if that's true?
I think we can all despair at what's happening in places in the world, and it's, heartbreaking. We see it nightly on our TV screens and feel utterly powerless to intervene or contribute to an answer. I can only, and these are places we've witnessed. Myself and Jo have spoken, as I think she mentioned. We've been there and seen it. A lot of conflict zones, people coming out of conflict and then going back into conflict. All I can say is, because I'm not, I'm going to backtrack here. I mentioned before, at one point I would have called myself a pacifist and believed that I felt violence was wrong. But I do recognize there are times when people have to defend themselves. Individuals and communities, and perhaps political formations like states, etc. I get that, I think it always has to be the last resort. In other words, you have to exhaust every other course to resolve whatever the conflict is. It's usually about someone else's greed or chasing scarce resources. It's a power imbalance. We know that. And the powerful, here's something I believe. It seems to me those with the most power seem to be the ones most willing to use that power in a violent way, and you wonder at that, And the people with the least power, forced into confronting with their limited resources, whether it's demonstrating, raising awareness, forming groups, etc., getting the message out there, then find themselves beaten off the street and finding no other recourse but actually literally defend themselves. And it was like that in the north. And so I could never say no. I cannot, because I've come through too much, I witnessed too much to say you cannot rule out violence. But it has to be the last resort. You can look back over the past and you can question whether we arrived at that moment. That's a legitimate and an important, mental exercise and study, a matter of study. I'd love, if somebody came up and said to me and proved it to me, you were wrong there, you could have went that way. That would have made the difference. I would applaud it, and shout that from every rooftop. Nobody's been able to do that yet.
Can I just ask Jo, what's your response to the same question?
Yeah, I also think about the children in Gaza, and it seems a faulty thinking to think that killing people is going to bring us peace, I believe, sustainable peace. There can be short-term gains, maybe, but I'm too aware of the legacy of what it leaves. And so it feels a shared responsibility of how can we have a world where people can be seen and heard, and we share resources and we listen, without killing each other, without dehumanization. At the same time, I do understand why Pat chose violence. I do understand that. And my heart breaks that there weren't other options available. I think, and Pat sometimes talks about it as well, that there is a cost to our humanity when we cross that line. Like, it's not talked enough about. Obviously, it doesn't work for the victims, but actually doesn't work for the person being violent. That there has to be a cost in humanity in that process. And my wish is that sometime as a global family we're a little bit more grown up and we've got other ways of communicating. At the moment it doesn't feel like we're getting any closer to that. So yes, I understand that people use violence, and my hope and wish is that we find a way so it never happens. But it requires change from a whole lot of people.
Okay, we can take 2 or 3 more questions, I think. Anyone else? Just one here, and then we'll come to you in the front, okay?
Hello. Thank you very much again, Jo and Pat, for a really inspiring presentation. I just wondered whether, given Jo in particular, where you have spent 300 of these sessions and plus lots more, no doubt, thinking and talking about the subject, which is, you know, dealing with the grief and the reconciliation after the trauma. Do you find that you must actually see all around the world the seeds of problems where you can now see that if this isn't dealt with, it is going to end in grief or trauma? Do you ever feel the instinct to intervene in a preventative way?
Only when I'm asked to. You know, I have been asked, and I will. And any intervention I do has to be done with huge emotional safety. Takes a lot of time, you know, and I would love to do more work like that, because I think that the emotional work that I've been doing, what I've been learning about myself, because I've learned so much about who I am. I've learned things I wouldn't have learned any other way. It wasn't about changing Pat, it was about changing me. And those skills that I've learned, I'd like to do more of that kind of intervention work in the future. So let's hope I get asked. Thank you.
Okay, just at the front here, please, Michael. Right at the end.
Thank you very much, Paul. What a brilliant evening it's been. Just a question for myself. I would like to thank you all. I thought Jo was absolutely brilliant. Pat, and your good self. This is just a personal question from myself. As I get older in life, I look back and I lost my friends in the Troubles. Yeah, mostly in the Irish Republican Army. That's what we grew up on. That's what we grew up on. Kids, teenagers from 17, 18, 19, 20. And a lot of them are in the graves. It's lived with me all my life. And I come here today and listen to your story. You know, a man that made the headlines, a woman that made reconciliation. Sometimes I look back in life and I said, what was it all for? And that's the way I look at it. What was it all for?
Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie.
Yeah, I was struck, Pat, by something you said when you went back to Belfast as an 18 or a 19, 20-year-old, and you said you were drawn back to witness and to learn. And I thought, well, we're here, we've all been drawn here tonight to witness and to learn as well. And this journey you've been on has also struck me, you and Jo, as a witnessing and learning journey. And I wonder what part the grieving has played in that, because the title of your book is Where Grieving Begins. And could you perhaps just say a bit about where grieving, the sorrow, has been taking you as you've journeyed in the witnessing and the learning? Both of you, perhaps just a word on that.
Yes, the title of my book is Where Grieving Begins, and I suppose that might be confusing. But I think I meant it in the sense that we can only really even begin the grieving process until we've, at some level, reconciled with the truth of what happened. You know, there'll be lots of truths. You know, it's a difficult one. But I don't think anybody can be fully have dealt with their own pain until there's a kind of a recognition of it, and we can all see what has happened to all of us. You know, to refer back to the last gentleman's comments. You know, and there will be people who think that you know, all that was sacrificed wasn't worth an ounce of blood spilt. And there are others who might think, well, what other choice did we have when you're under attack? I'm just trying to illustrate, I'm not going to go over it, the diversity of opinion on it. So we haven't come close to a position where we can grieve properly, I don't think. You know, not true grief, you know, I don't think so. It's a bit of an enigma.
Over here, Michael, and after this, maybe one more question.
Cheers, thank you both. My question was for you, Pat, and it's like a lot of the conversation has been around seeing Jo's father as a human. I guess the whole bomb, like the main target of that was Thatcher, and I just wondered if through like Jo's father you've seen her as a human, and if so, if that makes you feel any different about what you did, or if she is still kind of like this dehumanised villain in a sense.
Jo's dad was a cipher to me. I didn't know of his existence, didn't know of Jo's existence. We were targeting the British state. There was an identifiable target as a person. It would have been obviously Margaret Thatcher, but it was an attack on the British state. It was not, you know, very abstract, directed, you know, anger, you know. You identified what's keeping you down and you targeted. But see, when you start seeing people in a fuller light, fullness of their humanity, it's a realization I've come to, you can't hurt them. You know, you go out of your way to avoid them, you mightn't like them, but you wouldn't hurt them, you know. That appreciation is lost in conflict, you know, and it's lost at a cost to yourself and those. And there's been gains and there's things that you can point to progress, but we still carry the pain of what had to be done or what we felt was needed. We all carry that, you know, and that's a whole part of what has to be dealt with moving forward. I know that specifically from my own community and former colleagues, comrades. A lot of them are really damaged people, you know, and it's part of that whole, you know, pain that's out there. You know, you lose something of yourself in conflict. I remember talking to a British soldier, very good guy. He'd done a lot of thinking himself about it. He was actually an ex-SAS man. And he says, what the British Army did to you, let me say, what armies do to you in their recruiting and all of that, they break you. They break you mentally so that you'll respond, you know, without thinking to orders given, you know. And coming out, you look at all the damaged guys on corners begging and all of that, prisons full of people who couldn't deal with this, coming out and dealing with, you know, the realities of life out of the armies, various armies, you know. they have to recover. They have to undo the damage done to them in the training. And it feels like to me that there's a corresponding undoing that goes on just in meeting this other, you know. The cipher, Joe's father, Joe, all the people we were in conflict. That's what we're doing. That's the position we're in. We're nowhere near the position to grieve. But as I said, if you know somebody personally, how could you hurt them? You know, you'd rather hurt them. You'll go into another room, leave them. You know, to it. That's my view on it.
One last question. Anyone? Just at the back.
London. Joe, Misha Steve from McRaymond, as cocky me, agus Rugu agus took me Dushbat, London. I was born in a pub not too far away, 1969, the George Roby. So I grew up in London, the London Irishman. So what's going on?
Just hold it up straight.
So was going on, and became very politicized as a young age. Used to put up stickers in the school about the blanket protest, the hunger strikes, you know, from 9 years of age. I then left my parents at 11 to go back to Ireland because I was angry. I still am angry with the British state. First of all, I commend you for everything you've done here, Joe. I really appreciate it. But the British are not going to leave our state. You know, they don't seem to have learned anything. I've heard British politicians saying that they want the majority in a referendum coming up. Where does it go? Another 20 years, the conflict starts again with the younger people. Where does it go in the future? Conflict restarts again if we don't sort this problem out. Fair play to Joe, that's all right. Fair play, we need more people like Joe, because I commend her for the work she's done. And as an Irish Republican, it's not the English people we have a problem with, it's the British government. And people like you, and there's a lot of English people that want to understand. I think if we had more people like you, it would go a long way to bring us all together as countries. The end game is for Irish people and English people to come together in harmony. But while Ireland is occupied, it can never happen, truly, you know. So really it's just to see, like, I don't know if you want to answer that, is there a way forward if the politicians don't do something? But we definitely want to commend you, Joe, for what you've done and speak to Pat.
Appreciate your comments. I don't really want to go add anything further to the discussion of the political. I'm sitting here and with Joe and about going back over the whole story. I killed her dad. And I don't want to delve into the politics of it, you know. Sure, but yeah, thank you. I just think we're in a better place. We are in a better place, and there's a possibility of. There is a real distinct possibility of further progress, you know, but there'll be pitfalls too. And you never want to return to what we came through. But there you go.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. So at the start of this session, I asked about the difficulties in the reconciliation, and I wondered what the positives are in your reconciliation. So when you see each other for events like this, do you look forward to seeing each other? What are those really positive moments that you have together?
It can vary because we can have fallouts and then and there'll be, you know, silence, you know, off the radar, and then get an invitation and then you have to make a decision, you know. So it's never even, you know, the ups and downs. But yet there's faith in the process, because you recognize that there's something fulfilling in it. It's powerful. It's really powerful. And there's times I leave the field, so to speak, and other times I have to speak out here. I have to hear. I have to listen. I have to share. So it's a bit like that, you know.
Jo?
Yeah, I think the last 25 years have been extraordinary, and I think of the young me that wanted to bring something positive out of what had happened and didn't want to have an enemy, you know, and what Pat has given me is an opportunity to really create something very positive out of it. And I don't think I would have learned what I've learned if it hadn't been for this engagement. However hard it's been, however challenging, there's so many gifts, so many amazing moments. You know? And there's a new documentary that's been made about us, which it has some of the work that we've done recently, the last 10 years. And I know that Pat he won't be doing so much with me. I do a lot more on my own, but I'll be able to use the documentary to bring Pat into the classrooms where I go, into the community groups with this very, very powerful documentary. And I think we show what is possible. You know, at the moment in the world, there's so much hatred, there's so much people just feeling so much pain and suffering. The guy who actually made our documentary, his family are in Gaza. And the night of the screening, he shared with me how his family are suffering. And he said, but I'm carrying on and finishing this documentary because I need hope. And I think that's what this does. This extraordinary relationship gives me hope at times when the world is very dark. And it gives me a sign of, yeah, it's not happening around the world. There is hatred, we know that. But this is what is possible. And I'm really grateful today to be with you all to share, because this actually helps me as well. You know, this helps me to carry on with my life, to know that we can come together, we can share with you, or we can connect. And that is priceless, that is special. So, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jo Berry and Magee.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My appreciation to our panellists, to Jo, Pat, and our Collette here, who's handled a great evening very, very well indeed. And thank you all for supporting TTT by being here, listening to our journey as we progress in the seeking peace and reconciliation. It's lovely to have you in tonight, and thank you again. And be careful on the way home. Don't stay out too late.
I just need to add just a couple more things. There are some thank yous that are really important. We are sponsored by Archer's Financial Services tonight, so thank you to Noel Sainsbury and his team. We really appreciate his ongoing support. To the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund, without them our project wouldn't have the life that it does, so thank you so much to them, and to Martin Fraser, who's our ambassador in the Embassy of London. He is amazing and a great supporter of us, and we appreciate that very much. Thank you to Jerry on sound, to Chris on camera, thank you to the London Irish Centre, to Bobby, Amy, everybody here, and to all of my colleagues on the board, all of the trustees of TTTNIUK, and finally, thank you to Peter Finn, who is a psychoanalyst and works with us very, very closely. And if anybody has been triggered by anything we've spoken about tonight, Peter is around and available to speak to, and we can signpost people to relevant services across the UK. Thank you all very, very much.
Lovely. Well said, Collette. Thank you.